Alrighty, world history students, welcome to our next lecture for this week on ancient Egypt. The date we're using here, 3000 BC. So, yeah, these are obviously, I'm just really rounding these dates, and even archaeologists struggle to pin it down. But the key here is our second. What we do agree on is that Sumeria is an older civilization. And then the second oldest civilization that we have found is ancient Egypt, which is, again, pretty popular. You've probably had a lot of classes and a lot of studied it quite a bit, but we'll see what we can add to what you already know. Again, make sure you're taking notes, and you have three sections in which you can put those notes. The first one's pretty brief, and that is just talking a little bit about the country's geography. Ancient Egypt is actually in Africa. Sometimes we forget it's part of Africa because it's right on the border of the Middle East in Africa. And it's often referred to as the gift of the Nile. In other words, without the Nile River, the longest river in the world, also kind of cool because on our map, it actually looks like it's flowing up, which of course it isn't. It's flowing downhill from the mountains of Eastern Africa down to the Mediterranean Sea. But without that river, then you don't have Egypt. And that you can see by the map, that map shows the green, the civilization, constituted Egypt, is that it's surrounded by desert, and so it's a really thin line, and that wherever there's water, there's life, and there's Egypt, and wherever there isn't, there's not much else going on. So again, as I already said, Nile River, the longest in the world. That little fan at the end is known as the river delta. That's where the river fans out, and that creates kind of a wider spread of fertile land, and so it's really rich and really great for agriculture. And you get kind of a little more of a wider spread of geography. Again, what the river does is obviously it provides food. The river also provides protection because there's these things called cataracts. Cataracts are just waterfalls. And so as you head south along the Nile River, you get to these cataracts. And because they're pretty massive waterfalls, if an invading force trying to flow down the river or even up the river maybe would not be able to sail directly to there. They'd have to get out and port around these waterfalls, and so they kind of acted like natural barriers and protective measures. And then, of course, transportation. That water, even to today, is the superhighway of transportation. It was the easiest way to transport the most amount of people or goods, and so the river was great for, again, food protection as well as a means of transportation. And then, of course, you can see on the sides, either side, you had the Sahara Desert, so you weren't going to necessarily get attacked very much through the desert. There wasn't much going on there. So it really was a sheltered region, which again led to its prosperity and protecting it from some foreign invasions. The Greek historian Herodotus again famously said that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, product of it. Again, just looking at the satellite map, you can see the importance of the Nile River because you can see that where there's the river, there's life, and there's civilization, there's light. And you can see the dark regions on either side, the empty desert for the most part, because there's no water there. The two major cities within Egypt were Memphis and Thebes. They were the capitals, basically. As we'll talk about in a minute, there was a lower Egypt and an upper Egypt, and each of those had their biggest city. You had Memphis in the north and Thebes down in the south. And so kind of want to pose a question here. We're going to talk about Egyptian society, and kind of a thought that to take us through this is, would you rather be free? You get to make your own decisions and be accountable for your own life, but you got to fend for yourself. In other words, you got to take responsibility for feeding and clothing and housing and protecting yourself. Or would you rather be under the constant control of a ruler without freedom, but you have your basic needs taken care of? Because that's a very human question. It's a very important question when setting up different governments. And we're going to look at basically how the Egyptians chose to answer that question. And so part two, this is going to be a longer section called the land of the god kings. Remember, we talked about Sumeria, that Hammurabi and the rulers were often priest kings. In other words, they were god kings ruling either in the name of a god with the blessing of the god, or we're going to see the Egyptians actually take it a step further, claiming to be gods themselves. They saw government and religion as linked. There was no concept of separating church and state. They called it the one divine order. That what God wanted and what was religiously true had to be politically implemented by the government. This was considered very normal and natural until much later in history. Egypt actually, just like Sumeria, started out with small city-states. It was not a united empire. It wasn't a common nation of Egypt. They were small little city-states called nomes, where you get cities like Memphis or Thebes would be their own countries. First, the different city-states or nomes were united into a lower and an upper Egypt. And again, if you look at the picture, I don't know if we have a good picture, but lower Egypt is north and upper Egypt is south. And that's because it's dictated by the way the river's flowing. So where the river starts in the higher mountains in the south, that's upper Egypt. And then lower Egypt is where the river ends out by the Mediterranean Sea. And so first the nomes consolidated into two different geographical regions. And then eventually Pharaoh Menes was the first pharaoh to unite, the first ruler to unite lower and upper Egypt and to form what we would now consider the full Egyptian nation or empire. Okay. Also, this society was set up as a command economy. Actually, I'm going to try some. Oh, that messed it up. Sorry. Just trying to get that thing out of the way. Was set up as a command economy. And what that means is that everyone and everything was directed by the king. So again, that one divine order was the idea that the pharaoh had total control over his people, and that he was in charge of their housing, their clothing, taking care of the people, and in return, they served him and gave him absolute obedience as their pharaoh and their god. In other words, he could command what happened with the economy. Formed a typical traditional pyramidic hierarchy. You had the pharaoh up on top as the god king. Then you had the priests and nobles who served him and were related to him. Then you got traders and artisans, farmers and herders, and then the unskilled workers. And it's a pyramid because of the numbers of people in each group, where the majority of the people were down as the unskilled workers. And as you rose in the social hierarchy, there were fewer and fewer people who reached those levels. The Egyptian religion is polytheistic in that, and again, a lot of people are pretty fascinated. A lot of these gods, like Amun-Ra being the chief god of the sun, and then you've got Horus and Anubis and the different, pantheon of different gods, kind of the animal gods. But so they were polytheists like the Sumerians, multiple gods. They were also naturalistic, which we'll discuss this week, but basically means they saw spirits within nature. They believed the Nile was divine and had a spirit within it. The sun was divine, and that was Ra. That every physical objects within nature were imbued with souls and kind of enchanted, and that's what we mean by naturalistic. And then the polytheism means they had more than one god they worshipped. And kind of the central focus of the Egyptian religion was immortality. That a lot of it was life was spent preparing for their deaths so that they could pass into the afterlife and live immortally. And we're going to be looking at something called the Book of the Dead, which was basically instruction manual for how to enter the afterlife properly. Obviously, this leads to what we're talking about on the next slide, mummies and pyramids and all that interesting stuff. But again, to point out the same goal that Gilgamesh had, and the same thing that Adam and Eve lost. Their whole religion was about can we live forever? And so obviously Egypt famous for its tombs, its mummification, its art, its architecture like the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Great Sphinx there. They had most of the pharaohs we've excavated are from a place called the Valley of the Kings. The pyramids were the older period in Egyptian history, but they were so visible and such high targets. They were so robbed so often they began to hide their pharaohs and bury them on unmarked graves. And this was the Valley of the Valley of the Kings. Of course, most of them were found also and had their tombs robbed. And then, of course, these tombs being places for mummies, for mummification, because that obviously was a key part of the Egyptian religion in preparing bodies for the afterlife. Originally, mostly pharaohs were the only ones who were mummified. They were the only ones kind of worthy or had the ability to pass on to the afterlife. But then over time, it became more and more common for the lower classes to be mummified and have access to that afterlife, to the point that they would even mummify their pets so that they could take them with them. So it slowly became a little more democratic. This is a thing we'll be looking at with the Book of the Dead. That is Anubis. He's the god of death. Looking over the dead body, preparing the soul for its passage from this world into the afterlife. Now, again, as their chief focus of their religion. Key part of this was obviously they're writing as hieroglyphics. We have cuneiform in Sumeria, but in Egypt we have hieroglyphics like cuneiform. It's a pictorial, or they're pictographs. So they're not letters that you arrange to form words, but they're pictures, or symbolic pictures that represent actual things, and then you put them together to kind of string together a sentence. They had over 700 characters. Um, they were two different types of hieroglyphics. There was the kind of the more decorative ones, the kind of the fancier ones that you see on the pillars there, and then they had a more kind of a shorthand, kind of a sloppier hand that, again, if they were actually writing things out and it wasn't, for everyone to read and for it to be really ornamental, they had a fancier version. If you've ever looked at hieroglyphics and you thought, how could you ever take the time to write something that fancy and get the words out quick enough, they had a shorter form, a note form. And most hieroglyphics, again, are religiously centered or even historical accounts of what a king has achieved. And there in the center is the famous Rosetta Stone. And the story behind that was basically, if you ever had the instruction manuals from something you bought, you've got the section in English and the section in Spanish or in French, and who knows, sometimes you've got tons of languages in there. That's what this was. It had an account from later in Egypt that was written in 3 different languages, hieroglyphics. I think it was Greek, and there was a third language. And this is actually for up until about 150 years ago, we couldn't, maybe about 200 years, we couldn't read hieroglyphics. We had no idea what they meant exactly until we found the Rosetta Stone. And that allowed us to match word for word Greek, which we could read, and then therefore we could decode what the hieroglyphics actually meant. And that was kind of the opening salvo in our ability to read hieroglyphics and figure a whole lot more about Egyptian history and culture. Integrated into this was art, and the famous kind of 2D shoulder spread, walk like an Egyptian style. Again, a lot of the art depicted either kings and royalty, or they were depictions of gods in the underworld, and again, how to get to the underworld. The Book of the Dead being the example we'll look at this week. Education was heavy for priests and scribes and government officials. Only sons received education, and again, even then, only the higher classes of nobles and maybe the artisans received an education. And so thirdly, let's just kind of take a quick, really broad view of overall Egyptian history. Kind of a who's who, and a couple names and characters to be aware of. The first one I've already mentioned, he was Pharaoh Menes. You kind of think of him as the first united Egyptian pharaoh. He's the one who united Upper and Lower Egypt in what we'll come to know as the first dynasty. Then we have Ahmose I, another pharaoh, and he's famous for founding the New Kingdom and for driving out these foreign invaders named the Hyksos. And the only reason I'm mentioning him is, one, he founds what's going to be this thing called the New Kingdom, which is the most prosperous time in Egyptian history, most powerful time. But also the driving out of the Hyksos, they now believe, really coincides possibly with the story of Joseph. And you'll learn more about this in a video that you watched this week. But that in driving out the Hyksos might be related to those pharaohs or rulers in Egypt who show up and they don't know who Joseph and the Jews are there, and actually end up enslaving the Jews. So kind of worth noting. Then we have Hatshepsut, very famous as she was the first female pharaoh that we know of. She dressed, symbolically as a male, and you'll even see her shown with the traditional Egyptian beard at times. But again, she's often been commented as the first great woman of history, the first powerful female ruler that, again, in human history that we found recorded. Queen Hatshepsut. Ramses II, he's kind of the David or Solomon of Egypt, in that he is the most powerful Egyptian ruler. Egypt is at its greatest power and extent during his rule, and we'll look at a map of that in a moment. He ruled for 66 years, which is an incredibly long time. Means he lived to be about 80 years or so, and that's actually his mummy there. We have found his mummy, and so. Again, he's kind of represents Egypt at its most powerful, and as we'll learn, even though his name is Ramses II, he's most likely not the pharaoh of the Exodus, even though a lot of times that's mistakenly stated. There's just a picture of his empire. So Egypt, at its greatest influence, you can see stretched up into the land of Canaan. They ruled Israel. They went all the way up into Syria. And so even more than Sumer, which again, I guess you can't see what I'm pointing at there. You can see Mesopotamia on the top right. Egypt, even at its greatest extent, was a larger empire than the Sumerian or the Babylonian Empire. And that again was under Ramses II. Another pharaoh to note is Akhenaten. Akhenaten is a bit of a asterisk or a foot, not a footnote, but an asterisk in Egyptian history because he seems to have tried to change Egyptian religion from polytheism to monotheism. That he really tried to eliminate all the other gods but the sun god. Um, and so, in some people say he did that to solidify his own rule, because that he could represent the one sun god, and there's no other gods to appeal to, so everybody has to come to him. Other people, I see an interesting correlation to even that um, and the Exodus, because some people wonder if after seeing what happened under Moses and the great Exodus and the destruction of Egypt during the time of Moses, that they date Akhenaten to coming sometime after that, and him basically saying, you know what, we need to worship just the one God who destroyed Egypt. And so there's huge debate over that, but it is interesting that at one point an Egyptian pharaoh tried to convert Egypt to a single God, but people did not only did it during his lifetime. As soon as he died, his son, a very famous pharaoh named Tutankhamun, more commonly known as King Tut, changed it back and immediately went right back to the polytheism. That's a sculpture on the right of his wife, Nefertiti. That was the wife of Akhenaten, another very powerful Egyptian woman. And then we get to Ptolemy. And I just mentioned Ptolemy because he is actually not Egyptian, he's Greek. And what we get to later in this class is that Egypt, after its highest point under Ramses II, eventually falls under Greek rule by Alexander the Great. And then he sets up generals to rule Egypt. And so after eventually most of Egyptian history, they're no longer ruled by Egyptians, but they're ruled by foreign powers like the Greeks and the Ptolemies. And a descendant of Ptolemy is a very famous, probably the most famous Egyptian, and that is Cleopatra. Cleopatra is not Egyptian. She's actually of Greek descent, but again, her family was there for generations by her time of her birth. And she's the one who famously takes Egypt and puts her in an alliance with Rome and is a lover of both Julius Caesar and then his rival, Mark Antony. And so when we get to Rome, we'll be talking a little bit about Cleopatra, who's in charge of the queen of Egypt at that time. You can see in that picture that she, and even in the accounts, you can see that her hooked nose was of great remark, and that people pretty much said, a contemporary said, she wasn't that beautiful in a classical sense, but that she was just very charming, and it was her personality and wit that really won people over. And so a lot of historians consider that to be a pretty reasonable depiction of what she might have, close resemblance of what she actually looked like. Last thing, again, a lot of information here, but basically you want to think of the Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian history, as having four broad periods. The oldest is what we know as the Old Kingdom, and that's the period of the pyramids. That's when they built the pyramids at Giza. The three biggest ones are for those three pharaohs, Khufu, Menkaure, and Khafre. But eventually the Old Kingdom, there's a collapse into civil war, and arising out of that civil war comes what is known as the Middle Kingdom. And this is a time of resurgence, increased irrigation and agriculture and growth within the empire. But eventually this too falls into not civil war, but foreign invasion, the Hyksos that I mentioned earlier, who very well during this invasion might have been the time at which the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, they welcomed Joseph, they welcomed Jacob and his family. But then when the new pharaohs took over, they didn't recognize the Jews and basically ended up enslaving them. So we'll talk more about that, but that's one reason that we can likely date Joseph and the arrival of the Jews to around the end of the Middle Kingdom. And then finally, after the revival, after the Hyksos are driven out, we get to a third period, the New Kingdom. So Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. This is the time of Ramses. This is when Egypt's going to be at the greatest extent of its power, and even go up and rule parts of Canaan and Israel and Syria. And then the last part is what I mentioned is foreign domination, is when they then become under the power of other nations, first Persia, and then Alexander and the Greeks, and then finally Rome. And so you have a depiction there of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and the bottom Julius Caesar and Cleopatra during this period of foreign domination. So Egypt will come back again when we talk about Alexander and the Greeks, and then later when we talk about Julius Caesar and the Romans. Okay, so what? Egypt, first world power. Okay, second civilization, but again, we call it a first world power because they really went beyond even Egypt's local geography, local culture, and began to dominate and control places like Canaan under Ramses II, places like Syria, and parts of the Middle East, and even down south into parts of Ethiopia, a land they called Nubia. So it's kind of what we consider the first world power, which is interesting because you see the same thing in the Bible. The first real powerful nation that gets mentioned during the life of Abraham, and then of course during Joseph, and then of course the Exodus during Moses, is Egypt represents the first real strong and even dominating at times a civilization. And so we see that also concur through history and our archaeological studies. Also want to emphasize the recurring patterns we've seen between Egypt and also Sumeria, the importance of rivers to early civilizations, whether it's the Tigris and the Euphrates. We're going to see the same thing with the Jordan River in Israel, but then you have the Nile River that for Egypt. You also see the same pattern that it starts out in those individual city-states, individual countries. They were known as nomes, but then slowly the historical tendency is for them to unite and form a larger nation under a single ruler, the pharaoh. We saw the same thing in Samaria. We see the same tendency to worship, to mix the divine and the political, the civil government with the religion. And so we get god kings. The Egyptians, again, took it a step further than the Sumerians, where rather than saying, I rule in the name of God, the Egyptian pharaohs were actually thought to be or claiming themselves to be divine, physical manifestations of Amun-Ra here on earth. And similar to the Sumerians, they had an enchanted worldview, again, where they saw spirits everywhere. They saw that the natural world was imbued with a soul and a spirit, whether it was, again, in different animals or in different geographical features, the stars, the moon, the river. And so we see that that's the general tendency of these civilizations up through Egypt. And the reason I keep emphasizing those things, especially those last three, city-states to kingdoms, God, kings, enchanted world, is because Egypt is going to provide a sharp contrast with Jewish culture. After we talk about Egypt this week, we're going to be talking about Jewish culture, and that's really going to be the birth of Western civilization. Our culture today does not derive primarily from Sumerian and Egyptian culture, but with a sharp difference or a break from many of their practices and worldviews that the Jews, who all of a sudden kind of show up and people are like, what the heck, who are these guys? Why do they see things so much differently? And it's from that seed. Again, we talked about Western civilization coming from, first of all, Jerusalem. And again, so Egypt is important because it demonstrates a contrast with how they see the world versus how the Jews are going to show up and see the world. And the key event that's going to really highlight that is the Exodus, a cosmic battle between the former world power of Pharaoh and the Egypt, the God King of Egypt, the enchanted world, the polytheistic enchanted worldview, and then these Jews, these monotheistic Jews. And that's why we're going to be watching a documentary this week that looks intently at the Exodus. All right, well, thanks a lot. Hope that helps, and we'll be covering some more of this in detail during our live sessions this week. So talk to you soon.